September 1939, the German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
We have a great treat today. We have law professor Stanley Goldman as our guest. Stanley, much like myself, is a child of a survivor. His mother was the survivor, and she survived Auschwitz, of all places. Rather than me telling you the story about Stanley and about the book that he has written, I'll give the microphone over to Stanley right now. Hi, Stanley.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me on. Sure, my mother. I was raised an only child, even though I'd had an older brother and sister. They died in the camps, and my mother had survived Auschwitz, and we had never known exactly how she had survived, in the sense that she was moved to another camp after Auschwitz and was actually rescued. And by that I mean before the war was over and before the Allies came to liberate anyone. In this case, probably would have been the Russians. But regardless, she was rescued, and we never knew why when she was alive. And after she passed away, I finally decided to do some research and stumbled across a passage in a book that gave me a hint, and I kept following it up, and it turned out she was rescued in a rather remarkable way that gets a paragraph or so in a few history books, but it's never really been explored in depth. So I decided to start examining it, and after some years of doing some research and putting it together, I showed it to a friend of mine in Israel whose mother had survived the war with my mother, and she said, "Well, the book is fine, but you have to include your story with your mother and what it was like growing up with a mother who had gone through this." I hesitated, and then I started writing, and it turned out the next 4 years was basically my attempt to tell the story about my mother's life with me, my life with her, and how I thought things that had happened during the war obviously affected how I was raised and how she treated me, which was just in one shorthand, wrapped in bubble wrap. It was though the Nazis had long been defeated, they still lurked as far as she was concerned, and she was panicked whenever she couldn't find me. It would send her into her PTSD, and it was not an easy life, obviously. For me, nothing in comparison to what my mother had gone through, but it was only sort of as I made my way through the book and started looking at things my mother had said and done, and living with me, that I realized how much of it had come from the war and her experiences in the war.
Well, interesting that you mentioned all this about your experience of being a child of a survivor. My father, who was also a survivor of Mauthausen concentration camp, he had nightmares often. And people think that just because you survived, that it's over. Unfortunately, for the people who have survived, it's not really over.
Not over for them. And although you and I only live in the faintest shadow of their experiences, it lives on through the way we were raised and how we in turn behave, and it lives on in the societies in which they are in. I mean, there is no question, maybe a couple of 100 years from now, people will do research and show the impact the attitudes of Holocaust survivors had on America or England or Sweden, in the sense that some of them became extremely prominent people. Some of them became very influential people. Their children, occupy the Biden's cabinet to a degree never before seen. and to what extent is what their parents went through and how they raised them consequential in what they did in life, in what they did in politics or business or psychology or history or psychiatry or whatever the subject might be. So it is not that it just ends, at a given date when the war ends, or even ends at the death of the last survivor, which luckily we've not seen yet, but will come eventually. It lingers on.
Also, it's very individual, and depending on the circumstance. Your mother was in Auschwitz, and she lost her two children besides her husband, and I presume her parents. My
Yes.
father did not go to Auschwitz, but was in Mauthausen only for a few months. He survived, but he lost his parents and his sisters, two sisters, in Auschwitz at the same time period, and he didn't know about that. He only found out about that when we came back to Hungary. But
My mother had always believed that she was the ninth of 10 children, and she had always believed that some had survived. Especially, she had a sister who had moved to Belgium, and it didn't occur to her when she was going through the war, until she got into Sweden by way of this rescue, that she started discovering that they were all gone, including even her sister in Belgium had been taken off to the camps and killed by the Germans. So it was there was nothing left.
But also the fact that your mother lost children and she was younger than my father. My father was 41 years old. The intensity of the psychological damage, because I know about your mother from you. So this is not new information that I hear, but the audience hears only. The psychological damage that your mother received was more intense than what my father received. So it's very individual about the survivor's experience and how they can go on with their lives afterwards.
Yeah, and my mother's friend in Israel, who after the war she went to Israel, my mother came to America, but her eldest daughter, who's an artist in Israel, my age, once said to her 30 years before that when she had first met my mother, knowing about my mother having lost her two children and she herself having a girl and a boy like my mother had during the war, she asked her mother, how could Molly, my mother's name, Malka, how could Molly survive having lost her children? How could she go on living? And her mother responded, how can anyone go on living after such a thing? Now, what I didn't include in my book, though I knew it, her daughter didn't know it at the time. And that is, my mother had told me, which has proven to be true, that woman who was her best friend also had a child, a little boy, and he was killed in front of her by the Nazis. And she never admitted that she had a child. She only spoke of a little brother that she had had. And only after she passed away, only 4 years ago, by the way, her husband was still alive. And when in Israel, I was there for her death in Israel and her funeral. I was visiting at the time, as I visited every year, because they've become my family as much as anybody has, because I have no other relatives. But I told her daughter that her mother had in fact had a child, and she well understood the answer to her question, how can anyone survive this? And she denied it. And then we went to see her father, who was still alive, and we asked her father, and her father said, oh yeah, she was married and had a child before. Yes, he was killed by the Nazis. So she had, in her entire 70 years of life, she had never known this about her mother, and had acted as if my mother was unique in losing a child when her own mother had in fact lost one.
Excuse me, Stanley, we have to go to commercial break and we're back afterwards. Back to Never Forget. Our guest is Professor Stanley Goldman. law professor at Loyola Law School, and he wrote a book. Stanley, explain to us who are not so literary knowledgeable, what does this quotes mean?
Left to the mercy of a rude stream. If you want to find it, it's on Amazon. Just look under Stan Goldman. I got to say, in my defense, I didn't write the book like a law professor. I wrote the book hoping that 17 and 18-year-olds would read it, because a lot of the book deals with the experiences growing up as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, with the parents who had suffered such horrific PTSD and continued to act that way during her entire life, never having been able to get over it, obviously. Who could? So I wrote it very simply, although I did pick a slightly esoteric title, which is a paraphrasing of a line from Shakespeare. Actually, the first footnote I have explains the title. Well, let me just read it to you. It's like 3 sentences. I have selected Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream from William Shakespeare's last play, Henry VIII, as the title for this book because I saw it filling a dual purpose. The plain language of the words describe well my mother's wartime plight, meaning the phrase left to the mercy of a rude stream was used in Shakespeare to refer to the sort of flotsam and jetsam of history. You're a small reed in the rough waters of history, being dragged
Right.
along by it, trying to stop yourself from, in effect, drowning.
It's a very
While,
good metaphor.
while on the other hand, its original context, and as once referenced in part by the legendary novelist Henry Roth, the phrase appropriately applies to myself as an admission by the speaker, which was true in the book, in the play, by the admission of the speaker, myself, of having foolishly ignored his true circumstances until finally understanding it proved to be too late to change his course. And that's what I write about, what it was like growing up with a survivor under such circumstances, and that I had misunderstood my mother for decades. I thought she was, 4'11" and 93 pounds, maybe, and always gave the appearance of being very weak and fragile. And I walked on eggshells whenever I was around her, never wanted to upset her, knowing what she'd already gone through in her life. And I treated her remarkably, to the extent of basically giving up my life for a number of years with respect to doing things that, I couldn't do anything she didn't want because I was afraid to hurt her too much, and she'd already suffered enough. And it was only probably when I got into my 40s that I realized the mistake I had made, that my mother was in reality the strongest person I'd ever met.
She was definitely a tough cookie. There's an interesting part of the book about Himmler and your mom. Tell us about that.
I did some research on a German Jew who'd moved from Germany to Sweden. And my mother was rescued by some rather remarkable efforts made by these two guys who were, Jews living in Sweden. And it involved with actual negotiation with Heinrich Himmler. In the last months of the war, Himmler, like a lot of Nazis, were worried about their own skins and decided foolishly, and to give you an idea how insular intellectually and factually the Nazis were. Himmler, for example, believed that with a few, and he wasn't alone, with a few good deeds and good gestures, he might be able to save himself from any post-war, fate, such as execution, which he was concerned about. And one of the things he did was to accept the good auspices of this Swedish Jew by agreeing, after some considerable negotiation, to release a few women, Jewish prisoners, from a camp that was closest to Sweden, and that was Ravensbrück, where my mother was being housed. And she was sitting in the camp one day thinking she was going to be executed along with others, because they were still executing Jews in that camp. And all of a sudden there were these white buses there to take them off, in a rather harrowing and deadly experience. Some were killed by English bombers who thought, in spite of the Red Cross signs on the trucks, they were really Germans in disguise. And the British didn't seem to care whether they were hitting real trucks or carrying, Red Cross workers, or they were hitting the Germans, but they blew them up and killed some of the women who were with my mother. But my mother managed to get out by fleeing through a forest and making her way to Denmark, and then out of Denmark getting shipped on to Sweden. But all of that was only thanks to Himmler just deciding that he might cover his tracks a bit by doing something nice for the Jews, as if executing, Himmler was in charge of the Holocaust, as if killing 6 million Jews could be satisfied by freeing a handful of Jewish women who were in a death camp in the northern part of Germany. So that's how she got out, and it's a really rather harrowing and remarkable story, especially for the one particular Jew who flew in the middle of the war on a German plane with a swastika on it, a Jew flying into the heart of Germany to meet at a middle of the night secret meeting with Heinrich Himmler, the head executioner of the Nazis. He gets to Berlin. He's on a Nazi plane. He gets off the plane, and he's immediately met by a half a dozen fully dressed, in like dress uniforms, SS officers wearing the black uniforms. And as he gets off the plane, they literally all go like this in unison, "Heil Hitler!" to this little Jew who just got off the airplane. And it's described by not only him in a little letter that he wrote, but also by one of the Nazis who was there, that after being saluted Heil Himmler, he takes his hat off and says, "Good evening," and puts his hat back on. And then, of course, he's supposed to be taken to see Himmler in this secret meeting that Himmler doesn't even want Hitler to know about, because he's afraid Hitler will explode if he finds out he's trying to negotiate the release of a few Jews on his own. It really is a remarkable story that just simply was not told before.
Stanley, we can talk about this for hours, as you know, and hope to get you back in a different show again. And I hope people will pick up the book.
And as I said, it's on Amazon. It's on the publisher did an audiobook. It's on Kindle. It's also a hard copy. Just look up Stan Goldman and you'll find the book, as well as in some bookstores.
Show the book again.
It's published by Potomac Books, which is an organization that publishes history books, quite a bit about World War II.
Left to the mercy of the root stream. Stanley, thank you very much. Thanks for writing the book, and we'll have you on again.
Thank you again, Steve.
I'll be right back after this commercial break. Thank you. Welcome back to Never Forget. And also never forget to help us with your donations. We need it for Holocaust education. And I would like to ask you to help us not only for this program, but for the Holocaust education that we're doing in Eastern Europe as well as here in America. Now please listen to Remedy, our Jewish rapper, singing Never Again.
Baruch atu Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher yishon v'mitzvoyot, v'roshevonu v'shabbatot shoel, v'avotonim chilonu, v'koroinu ma'aseh bereishis.
To all those races, colors, and creeds, every man bleeds for the countless victims and all their families of the murdered, tortured, enslaved, raped, robbed, and persecuted. Never again. To the men, women, and children who died in their struggle to live, never to be forgotten. Reuben Ben Menachem, yeah, my own blood, dragged through the mud, perished in my heart, still cherished and loved. Stripped of our pride, everything we lived for, families cried. There's nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. Tossed to the side, access denied. 6 million died for what? Yo, a man shot dead in his back. Helpless women and children under constant attack for no reason till the next season. And we still bleeding, yo, it's freezing. And men burning hell, some for squeezing. No hope for a remedy, nothing to believe. Moving targets who walk with the star in their sleeve. Forever marked with a number tattooed to your body. Late night, eyes closed, clutched to my shoddy, having visions, flashes of death camps and prisons, no provisions, deceived by the devil's decisions, forced into a slave, death before dishonor for those men who were brave, shot and sent to their grave, can't awaken, it's too late, everything's been taken, I'm shaken, family, history, the making, never again shall we march like sheep to the slaughter, never again shall we sit and take orders, stripped of our culture, robbed of our name, never again of our freedom and thrown into the flames, never again from our families, taken from our homes, pulled from our gods and burned of our bones, never again shall we march like sheep to the slaughter, never again leave our sons and daughters stripped of our culture, robbed of our name, never again of our freedom and thrown into the flames, never again from our families, taken from our homes, pulled from our gods and everything we own, never again. Some fled through the rumors of wars, but most left for dead, few escaped to the shores with just one loaf of bread, banished, called in for questioning and vanished, never to be seen again. I can't express the pain that was felt in the train to Auschwitz, tears poured down like rain, naked face to face with the master race, hatred, blood of David, my heart belongs to God and stays sacred, rabbis and priests, disabled individuals, the poor, the scholars, all labeled common criminals, mass extermination, total annihilation, shipped into the ghetto and prepared for liquidation, tortured and starved, innocent experiments stripped down and carved up or gassed to death. The last hour, I smelled the flowers, flashbacks of family then sent to the showers, powerless, undressed, women with babies clung tight to their chest, crying, who were the guests dying? Another life lost, count the cost, another body gas burned and tossed in the Holocaust. Never again shall we march like sheep to the slaughter, never again leave our sons and daughters stripped of our culture, robbed of our name, never raped of our freedom and thrown into the flames, never again from our families, taken from our homes, never again from our God and everything we own, never again shall we march like sheep to the slaughter, never again shall we sit and take orders, stripped of our culture, robbed of our name, never again of our freedom and thrown into the flames, never again from our families, taken from our homes, never again from our gods and burned of our bones, never again, never again, never again, never again. The final solution is now retribution. Remedy, Wu-Tang.